Hey friends, we just finished one more week of the I Love You More group study, and I am so proud of you. This week we did I Love You More and My Perfection, and Holly Cox is here with me today.
Hey guys.
She is a campus pastor assistant at New Spring Church in Greenwood, South Carolina, and she also does a lot of their women's ministry, so that's super awesome. I'm glad that you do that. Holly, before that, was an elementary school teacher for 4 years, and she came to know Jesus at the age of 7. But before we talk to Holly, I want to tell you this. Now that you've read the chapter and now that you've done the study, you know that I struggle a lot, or used to struggle, with loving Jesus more and my perfection. I just tried to work out my salvation. I felt guilty about what Jesus did for me on the cross for so many years. And then he finally just took me on a journey where I went through postpartum depression and I couldn't pick myself up, and finally just realized I needed his grace. And at that point, I realized that grace is the only way that we can receive his salvation. So this week we studied the tabernacle, which I know was super intensive, so I want to give you guys lots of stars for getting through this week's study. It's probably the longest one in the whole group study, but it's so important because we learn that worship is relevant in so many different ways. It's not just singing songs and raising our hands. It's repenting. It's giving our lives as living sacrifices. It's entering into the gate and knowing that Jesus is the gate and he's the way that we receive grace. It's all of those things. So congratulations on finishing this week. And now I want to talk to Holly. Holly, you did this study, and you actually done it with a test group of girls in the church, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Have you guys enjoyed doing this together?
We have. We've seen lots of girls open up about things in their lives that they just have struggled with for years, that they've just kind of hidden away, but through things that you've discussed in the book, they have opened up about things and are starting to experience freedom through that and healing. So
yeah, I think that the neat thing about this book is that the title is called I Love You More, except when I don't, fighting to make Jesus first. And I think the thing is, it seems like such a simple subject. But loving Jesus more than ourselves really isn't simple.
Right.
It's hard.
That's what we've discovered too.
Yeah, because, when Satan fell from heaven, the reason that he fell was because he was worshiping himself more than he was worshiping God.
Right.
And that's the biggest temptation we have. So when you read the chapter, I Love You More Than My Perfection, what stood out to you the most? What did you learn from that chapter personally?
Yeah, I think the first thing was just that we are imperfect people who lived in a messed up world, and God's trying to perfect us in this world. And then the second is the whole idea of grace, and how we're none perfect, and we're not always going to get it right. We're going to mess up. And the other thing is the whole being overdoing, that God doesn't want us to perform for him. He just wants us to simply be with him and let him create us into who he wants us to be.
Yeah. I think we're tempted to do because it's measurable.
Oh, yeah.
You know? In the book, I used the example of getting stars on a chart, or I remember when I used to make straight A's, my mom would buy me a strawberry shortcake doll. And then when I was out of strawberry shortcake dolls, she started buying me Star Wars figures because I love Star Wars. But doing is measurable, and when you do something for God, you see something. You can almost hold it. You can tell someone what you did, and it makes you feel good, you know?
Yeah.
But all of that the being is the heart issues that we don't always see, that we can hide. And it's harder to go in there and dig out that soil of our heart and figure out what's going on and letting God change that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because I was like you, I got the money or the gift for making the straight A's, and so that just kind of ingrained in the whole performing to meet people's expectations, or to exceed people's expectations even, rather than just becoming who God created me to be, and being comfortable and confident in that, and not trying to strive to make the grade, even though I might not have been good at math. I was still I was horrible at math, but I would strive to make the A in math, instead of being okay, I'm going to give it my best and go play tennis and become better at tennis than I was, because I was so focused on being this straight A math student instead of the tennis player that I could have become.
Yeah. I think that we are very hard on, when I hear the scripture about the Pharisees and them being whitewashed tombs, I want to point my finger and say, oh yeah, they were so mean, whitewashed tombs. But then when we realize that sometimes we'll get into that game of doing performance, making the outside look so good, and inside we're not taking care of that. It's so easy. And I realize I can't point my finger at the Pharisees and accuse them of being terrible, because I'm really just like that sometimes. So what did you learn about the character of God from this study?
I think the biggest thing that I learned was from your description of when the story of Genesis, when Adam and Eve were in the garden and God kicked them out, and how God didn't push them out of the garden because he wanted to punish them, but because he wanted to make them back into who he had originally created them to be, because they had eaten from the tree of knowledge, and so they had become a way that God didn't create them to be. So his whole idea was to bring them back into right relationship with him, was his whole purpose in kicking them out. And how a lot of times, I'm sure Adam and Eve felt this way, but we feel this way, that God's withholding something from us when really he's just trying to make us more into who he intended for us to be. And how sad would it be if they lived forever in the state of their sin, but God has so much more for them. And so he wanted to take them out so that he can make them something new and back to their original design.
It's kind of like discipline isn't pleasant at the time. That's what Proverbs talks about, but it does good things in our lives. And God had to discipline Adam and Eve because they had invited evil into their hearts.
Yep.
And so he didn't want them to live forever. That's what I talk about in the chapter. He didn't want them to have to live forever in their sins. So he gave them the gift of death, which sounds terrible. And we were talking about this earlier, that death doesn't seem like a gift. It's usually something we're afraid of.
Right.
But when we know Jesus, we don't have to be afraid of it. And my 93-year-old grandma, she is awesome. But whenever I go see her, she's like, honey, I just don't know why I'm still here. I just wish the Lord would take me away. I don't know why he's leaving me here on this earth. And I think if we can see it when we're good with Jesus, when we know that his grace covers our sin, we can be okay with death. It's sad to leave the people that we love, but we know that something better is coming.
Right.
And that something better is like the better version of us, the perfect version.
Yep.
Which
I think is hard for our minds to imagine, because we feel like our life is good here on earth, but to think that God has something even more than Ephesians talks about, the more than we could ask or imagine, and that's just hard for us to comprehend sometimes, I think.
So we might have already kind of covered this, but what did you learn about yourself primarily in this chapter? What is like the one thing that you said, when I walk away from this is what I learned about my perfection?
I learned that for me, like, I grew up in a church that was a Southern Baptist church, and so although I got a lot of foundation that I'm so thankful for, it also came with like just legalism, and so I found myself in chains of legalism until I went to college. And then after like being in college and through the last couple of years, even though those chains were broken, I still would have perceived expectations that God put on me, or perceived expectations that other people did, or even ones I would put on myself that weren't really real or true. They were just ones that I'd perceived. If I'm really performing for God and doing what I'm supposed to be doing, then it looks like this. And so I would put those expectations on myself and not show myself grace. And then it would just lead to disappointment and frustration, and that I'd only do that to myself, but to other people as well, like putting expectations on other people that aren't realistic. Like, if they loved me, they would, and fill in the blank, or if they cared for me, they would do this, when really I wasn't showing them grace. I read in a book recently that, are we living our relationships under expectation or grace? And I got so convicted, because I was like, how many of my relationships am I living in under and like putting expectations on people and not letting them just live in the freedom of grace and just being friends and enjoying life together, instead of causing frustration and doubt and disappointment just because they weren't meeting an expectation.
Yeah, so expectations are hard, because I think we all have them. We don't know what they are, I think, until someone disappoints us, or we disappoint ourselves, or God disappoints us, really.
Right.
But that's another chapter, right?
Yeah.
In the book. So what would you say, the last question that I want to ask is, if you're thinking about this chapter in the book and you're thinking about your friends, if you're thinking about the lost, your family, how would you take this chapter and the things that you've learned and apply them to the people around you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways that I would encourage people in, and one of them is just taking time to be with Jesus. And because I know for our quiet times, we can make that a checklist and a to-do list, but to really use that time to be with him. I know for me, like, for a long time it was, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to pray, I'm going to read my Bible, I'm going to journal, and every day needed to look like that. And if I started a study, I needed to do that same study every morning, but just living in grace in that too, of like, it doesn't have to look the same every morning. It can be, this morning I can read a chapter in my Bible, but tomorrow I may read a devotional, and just realizing that all God really wants me to do is to wake up and to spend time with him, but taking it beyond our quiet time as well into, Annie F. Downs, I listened to her podcast, and she talks about we are able to create the tone for the environments that we're in. And so taking that into every part of your day, like whether it's driving to work or, when you're making dinner, like what are ways that we can be with Jesus in those moments, whether that be through like, worship or whatever. And I know you talk about even in a worship service, not even, being able to worship God because of things that you were dealing with, the guilt you were feeling, and just like letting even those moments be times where we're being with Jesus and not being weighed down by the expectation or the routine of things, but just being free in those moments to let Jesus just speak to us and us be who he wants us to be. Right. But I'd also say get ourselves into community that can speak into our lives and call us out when we're trying to perform. And I think first of all that takes opening up to the people in our community and letting them know that we struggle with this or whatever struggle it is that people face, so that they can speak that life into us. Hebrews 10:24 and 25 talks about that, like spurring one another on and meeting together and encouraging one another towards love and good deeds. And so, making sure that we're surrounding ourselves with people who are going to do that for us. And then the last would say, just extend grace to each other, like realizing that we are not always going to get it right, and neither is anybody else in the world. And so just living free of those expectations, and just realizing that we are all waking up every day trying to live out James 1:22 of listening to Jesus and do what he says.
Yeah,
so.
That's so good. So good, Holly. I'm so glad you're here. So I have one more question for you, and this is a surprise question.
Okay.
But because you've gone through this study, or a lot of it, with a group of ladies, how would you advise other leaders that are going through this study? Just how would you encourage them, I think? Not necessarily advise, but what would you encourage them with as we end today?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the grace, because it covers a lot of deep stuff, the book and the study, and so realizing that every girl is going to get something different out of it, and so meeting them where they are and walking with them through what God reveals to them, but not taking it easy on them in the sense of excusing like them from going deeper as well, like so kind of having the balance there of not pushing too much on them, but not letting them hold back. I know in my group, we can be really general with each other because we want to put up that mask or that front, but being willing to say, okay, explain that to me, tell me more. And I think that's helped our group open up a whole lot, is by us like digging into each other and being that Hebrews 10:24 through 25 community.
Awesome. Well, Holly, thanks for sharing. I know that this can be intimidating to talk to a camera and be here having a conversation. We just want to pour into you ladies who are going to do the study. And my main goal is to be vulnerable and authentic in these videos, so that as you start your group every time when you get together, you feel like we can help you break the ice for the conversation that you're going to have with the people who are around you and with your group. And I hope that has been something that we've been able to do today. Perfection isn't possible for us as human people, but it is possible for God to make us perfect as he is perfect, and that's just a process. So we're not going to meet anybody who meets every expectation. We're going to be disappointed, and people are going to fail us. We're going to feel like God feels us. And I heard I read a book one time, and it said, if you need to forgive God for something that he's done to you, that you perceive that he's done wrong to you, he's big enough for you to say, I forgive you, Lord, for this, you know? And he's not going to hold that against you. And so if you're someone who feels like God has failed you, or you had expectations on him and that hasn't happened, look, just go to God and say, Lord, I forgive you for failing me in this way, and I want my relationship with you restored back. So I hope that you guys have a great group study today. I know that you will, and I can't wait to see you next week.